We talk a lot about soils here on Ag PhD, and chances are you think quite a bit about your soils too. But are you thinking about your soils in the top few inches, or are you thinking about your soils deeper down than that on a regular basis?
Well, that's what everybody talks about though, Brian, is the 0 to 6 inch soil sample. When we talk to guys, they say, well, my nutrient levels are right here, my soil pH is right here, and I say, well, at what part of your soil profile? And a lot of times I get, well, what do you mean? I took soil samples out there. Yes, how deep were they? And in almost every case, it's 0 to 6 inches. Or we get a 0 to 24 inch core.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know, that's awful deceptive because you could have
just like
a
taking
tremendous
composite
difference.
soil samples. It's the same kind of thing. We want to know what's your top 6 inches like, then what's your next 6, what's your next 6, what's your next 6. And I'm not saying you have to do this in every spot in every field because that would cost a lot of money, but at least in a few spots, in a few fields every year, find out what's down a little bit deeper. So right now we wanted to address some of the things that we do find that are a little bit deeper or that we don't find, starting with nutrients and the lack of them.
Well, when you do some digging around on your farm, one of the things that you're going to see as you go deeper down into your soil, like on our farm, we'll dig some root pits down 4 or 5 feet deep and look at the root system of our plants all the way down. A great time to do this is midsummer when our plants are about at their peak for vegetative growth. They're also at their peak for their root system growth too. And when you look down deep in the soil profile, you'll see just tremendous roots up in the top 6 inches. Then they'll be a little less prolific the next 6 inches and so forth. And as you go down, a lot of times what you end up with is long, skinny roots without many root hairs. And you say, well, why is that? Why can't I get better root growth down deep? The reason is because what are plants looking for? They're looking for nutrients. Yes, they need some water too, but what they're pulling that water in for mainly is to pull in nutrients. Every time the plant is hungry for one nutrient or another, it's going to pull in water. And if it doesn't have enough water in the top 6 inches, well, the roots are going to go deeper looking for more water, hoping they can pull some more food in with it. The problem that we have in most soils that we look at, I mean like 99% of soils that we look at, we just don't have hardly anything for fertility when we get to that second foot down in the ground. And at that point, that's where we start limiting our yield, especially when it gets stressful and dry in the summer.
Well, even in a lot of cases, below 3 inches, there's not a lot of soil fertility there. So when we talk about these drought years, most of the time, there is very little moisture in the top 3 inches, if not even 6 inches of ground. But if you've got roots down at 12 inches, 18, 24 inches, quite often we have some moisture down there, especially in heavier soils. But what good does that moisture do us if there aren't any nutrients down there too? If all your nutrients are up top where the soil is dry, how can those nutrients possibly get into the plant? So what we're trying to tell you is if you can get more of your fertility down a little bit deeper in the soil, you're going to have a more drought tolerant crop. And yes, it might not pay off for you next year or the year after, but sooner or later, we all know we're going to run into some drought conditions. It might be drought for a summer, drought for a month, or even drought for a week or two. If you can have some moisture and some fertility down a little bit deeper, you're going to have a lot better crop.
All right, here's the next challenge. One of the first root pits that we dug on one of our fields, it was interesting because the crop above ground was really drought stressed. It was hot, it was dry, and we just didn't have enough water. Well, we dug this root pit down about 4 feet deep, and the next morning came back to the field and there's water sitting in the bottom of the pit. Yet here's our crop standing right above it and it can't get to the water, and the reason why was compaction. Compaction can be one of those things that limits you, whether it's at a 6 or 8 inch deep plow pan or whether it's that natural layer of compaction that may be down in a lot of soils at 14 to 17 inches, somewhere in that range. You know, that compaction layer has a purpose of keeping some base to your soil so you don't just sink away every year. You've got some kind of firmness out there, but if that gets too firm, there are ways to manage that.
Well, what we've typically done in our operation is gone out and done zone building, where we're basically going with a straight shank, narrow point. So we're not trying to rip everything up. We're just trying to cut some slots so our roots can get down below that natural hard pan that we have in the soil. When you go deep and you rip everything up, basically all you're ending up doing a lot of times is lowering where your hard pan is. It was at 14 inches, now you just moved it down to 17, 18 inches, whatever it is. And eventually you're going to reform that hard pan. I wanted to come back to one thing quick on the nutrients too. When we're talking about nutrients and getting them deeper, we don't have an issue with nitrogen, sulfur, and boron because they're leachable. They can move down through the soil profile. But things like phosphorus, potassium, and zinc, they don't move in soil. They're exactly where you put them for the most part. So you're going to have to find some way to place them or move them down a little bit deeper in the soil if you want to get them there.
Well, deep nutrient placement is sure a good idea in many situations. I really like the strip till that we're doing on our farm with a shank, where we can drop those nutrients in at 8 or even 10 inches deep in the soil. That gets them through that top few inches where we often see stratification. It gets them down into a zone that's going to stay moist a lot longer in the season, and we see a lot better performance on our crops, especially like the last 2 years when we've come through drought and still had pretty decent yields for the most part. So that's a big deal. The other thing is soil pH, Brian, and we get a lot of questions about my soil pH in the top few inches is this, but what if my soil pH deeper is either high or low? What can we do?
Well, quite often we find that the deeper soil pH is more neutral, and we've done something to screw up the top 6 or 12 or even 18 inches of soil. So we just have to get that back in that equilibrium, get it back in that 6.3 to 7.3 range. That's really what we're looking for most crops.
Well, and a lot of times when we do see that pH rising, it's because we have a drainage issue.
I think that's the real key to everything, because if you have too much water and that water table gets up to a foot or even 6 inches, even for just a few weeks in the spring, what happens is there's no oxygen anywhere in that water table. That's a bad deal. So you have roots that die, bacteria that dies, fungi that dies, lots of other soil life that dies. How can you build something when you've got death going on in that area all the time? So you've got to keep that water table down, keep the oxygen in there. You'll have more organic matter in the long term. You'll have a lot better crop growth, and eventually you should have higher yields where you have good drainage.
Well, when we talk about soils, a lot of times, and we are guilty of this just as much as anyone else, we're focused on the top 6 inches of soil. What are we going to do about that for tilth and fertility and all these things? But we really want you to take a look at your soils deeper for a long-term impact on your farm and also a short-term impact for this year. Deal with those issues like compaction, soil pH, where your nutrients are placed, and drainage. All those things are really key to keeping your farm successful for years to come.
Well, another thing that's a key is having good weed control. We'll show you how to stop this week's weed coming up next.